The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is Unit 3, so welcome. And I'm looking forward to working with you over the next hour. Look, just want to make sure I'm being heard. Could I ask you if you could just go to the question box there and just type in the word clear? That just lets me know that I am coming across loud and clear. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Sue. Okay. Thanks, Marianne. Thanks, Dan. All right. Good. Coming across loud and clear. Now, you'll get a recording, of course, of the presentation at the end. So that will be supplied to you at the end of the presentation. So let's get underway. I've just got a message here from Sue. Okay, thanks, Sue. You won't be attending for the whole hour, but that's fine. Thank you for letting me know. Not that I'd know otherwise, but I appreciate you letting me know. All right, so we're going to talk about an interesting topic today, and we're going to talk about creating thinking space and managing time. Now, why would I be interested in running a session on that? Well, the reality is, as a senior leader, you are stretched with your time. I know that for a fact because I've never met a senior leader yet who has plenty of time on their plate to do all the things that they need to do. So one of your challenges is to manage distraction. Now, the reality is we are being bombarded with information from everywhere. It's coming from all sources at any time. So we can be completely taken off track very, very quickly and simply just by an interruption or a crisis or something. So we have to be very vigilant in terms of how we manage our thinking space. And obviously that means managing our time. So that's why we're covering this topic today. So I'm going to give you a few tips, obviously, on how you might do that and what's worked for me and what I've suggested to other people. So you can see there on your screen the program. So we're up to Unit 3. We've covered the personal influence and we've covered the strategically managing performance aspect, and now we're talking about managing time and space. And of course, we've got the other 3 modules to come, which I won't go into in great detail because we'll cover those in due course. All right, so at any time, obviously, you've got questions, ask them. And the other thing is, of course, you'll receive a copy of this presentation, both the recording and the slides, probably this afternoon. I'm certainly scheduling it to be sent out this afternoon. So there's 3 things I really want to cover with you in this session for an hour. I want to talk about this concept of the third space and where it came from. You may have heard the term, you may not, but I certainly need to talk about it with you. And then I want to talk to you about getting your thinking straight about what your role is and give you a chance to really reflect on how you can be even more effective in your executive position. And obviously I'm going to share with you a whole bunch of tools around things that you can do in order to manage your time and your thinking space. So this is pretty much a topic that's, well, I wouldn't say it was unique to your needs. I mean, anyone in a leadership role probably needs to be doing these things. But at your level, it's enormously challenging because you've got so many balls in the air, so many things that you're trying to deal with at once. So what is this third space concept that I mentioned? Now, great book here, and I'd certainly recommend it to you, by Dr. Adam Fraser, which is called The Third Space. And essentially what the third space is creating a buffer between the various activities in your day and in your life so that you can move from one activity to the next, but through a buffer. Now, the obvious one that we can think of is home and work. So if you drive home, for example, you may think that that's a buffer, but often when we walk through the door, we greet our loved ones, sometimes we start treating them like our our employees because we haven't actually made the psychological adjustment when we get home, even though we've been in the car for a period of time, or if you take public transport, the same thing. So the first and obvious thing is, how can we actually psychologically readjust from work to home? Now, in this book, there was a very interesting little story of a person who, when they arrived home and they were all dressed up with their tie and suit on, they'd walk through the front door, meet the family, and they'd treat the kids like employees and their wife like their EA, because they hadn't made the psychological step, that they're back at home, even though, of course, they knew they were. So the interesting story in the book, and it's a little bit extreme, is that what this person did is got a carpenter to build a knock a hole in the wall and basically build a doorway straight into the bathroom. So they'd arrive home in the garage and they'd go straight into the bathroom from the garage, so they wouldn't see the family. They'd have a shower, get into their daggy old clothes, and go out and meet the family. And that made a huge difference in terms of getting into that or making the readjustment to the psychological space at home. Now, I'm not suggesting you do go to that extreme, but that's an example of the third space, to be able to create a space or a buffer. A more obvious example for you is that you probably are used to having back-to-back meetings. And this is not a good thing. It might sound like you're being very efficient going from back-to-back meetings. At your level, you should be able to dictate, unless, of course, you're being called in by the CEO. You should be able to dictate when you have these meetings. And I strongly recommend that you have a 10 to 15-minute buffer between meetings at the very least. Now, the reason for that is so that you can start to get your head around adjusting from the previous meeting to the next meeting. And, what might you think about? Well, the key question you should think about is this: what do I want to get out of the next meeting? Now, if you move from one meeting to the next, you probably aren't going to think about that. You're just moving from one meeting to the next. Sometimes it's even in the same room. But if you create this buffer between meetings, you can actually answer this question: what do I want to get out of this next meeting? Because I'm assuming it's going to be a different goal and a different objective for the meeting. So my first and obvious response to you creating this third space is to, if you've got an EA who schedules your diary, or if you do it yourself, try to put a buffer between each meeting. You will find that you'll be hugely more efficient and effective, and you'll find that you'll be, but just by investing 10 to 15 minutes between meetings, and that doesn't mean just sitting down and burying yourself in emails. It just means perhaps just thinking carefully about what you want to get out of the next meeting and how you might go about doing that. You'll find that that will be, if you did nothing else out of this but just did that, it'd make a big difference. Now, the other thing I'd suggest is, if you do have an office, I would strongly recommend that you close your door at different times, not all the time. Obviously, you don't want to close it all the time, but it's quite fair and reasonable for you to have closed door time. The fact is, there are things that you need to do that require 100% concentration and attention. Close your door. People should know that if your door's closed, that means you're obviously taking something, you're doing something very important, and it's likely that people won't interrupt you in those moments. And so you're creating a space for yourself to get on and get, a report completed, or something that's requiring some serious attention, such as a phone call or whatever, or even a meeting itself. So you can still have an open door policy and close your door every now and again. I don't know whether you don't have to be all, people say I've got an open door policy and they leave their door open all the time. And of course they get bombarded by all sorts of requests and all sorts of interruptions. They're not managing the distractions particularly well. And of course they're not doing service to what they're doing in their office. And of course they're not probably paying a huge amount of attention to the interruptions either. So close your door, and I strongly recommend that you do that at different times during the day, and people will know, of course, a closed door means you're working on something that's fairly important, I guess. And then the other thing I'd strongly recommend you do, and it might sound a bit strange, but schedule out and about time. I often talk to executives in my coaching sessions around this, and they say to me, I just don't have time to get out and about and talk to my people. So that's going to be a problem for you in the long run, because one of the first things that you might do is something that's very tangible in front of you, but it's very, very important that you're out and about. You don't want to be criticized as somebody that doesn't get out and about and is, communicatable and, is in touch with what's going on at the coalface, so to speak. So if that's a problem for you, then I suggest what you do is you schedule it in your diary. So you actually say, from 2 to 5 this afternoon, I'm going to visit different sites, or I'm going to go and, present at different, I'm just not going to be office bound during that time. So do that and try to do that regularly so that you do, because it's highly underrated, but it's very, very important. You need to be out and about, talking to people. What are they doing? Not in some micromanaging way, but you just need to build alliances and build up relationships with the people you lead in a broader sense, and not just your immediate team. So that's another thing I suggest you do. Have a no meeting day. Now, at your position, you could probably do that, I guess. What you could do is just, if you've got an EA, then I recommend that you say to your EA, don't book any meetings on Friday for me, unless, of course, it's, the CEO, but you might even then let them know that it's a no meeting day as far as you're concerned. Now, by doing that, of course, you're going to catch up on a whole lot of other things, because our whole life, of course, revolves around meetings. So if you can create a space where you don't have meetings, you'll probably get a lot of things done that you need to get done that require quiet time. So that works very, very well for you. And then, of course, the other option is to say, have a meetings day. And so, you might just schedule all your meetings one after the other with a 15-minute buffer between on the same day. So what you do is all your catch-up meetings, all your check-ins, all the meetings that you need to do, you have them all scheduled on one particular day. So that's another way of organising yourself. So have a think about some of these things. Some of these things will resonate with you. Some of them will be practical. Some of them may not. But the whole purpose of this is to try to organise your time to be even more efficient. Your time's very valuable, and you need to look after it, because if you don't, you'll be bombarded from every which way in order for people to have a piece of you, and that's not necessarily the most productive use of your time. Now, that doesn't mean being unapproachable, but you need to create the spaces for that to happen. The other thing I'd suggest you do, if you're not into the habit of doing it, plan your day out before. Now, we've moved a long way. I mean, to-do lists are a good thing, and if you don't have a to-do list, I suggest you do. I don't use a to-do list anymore. I use Google Calendar, and I just plan out the day, put all my meetings in, put all my activities in the calendar, even color-coded, so that I know exactly what I'm doing. So obviously now there's a code in my diary saying lunch and learn, and this is what I'm doing, and I obviously planned to do that months ago. And just before this, I had lunch for half an hour, and prior to that, I had another lunch and learn. So just, it's really worth you making a plan for each day. Don't just fly by the seat of your pants. It's not a good idea. I'd be interested to know how many of you do plan your day, and if you want to share that with me, you can. And I guess if you don't, tell me what the perils of that might be. If you're brave enough to go on and type something in there, I'm more than happy to have a listen to what you've got to say. Now, the other thing is reflect on each day. Now, good leaders are reflectors. So think about what went well, what didn't. So when I'm planning out my next day, what I do is I look back on the previous day and do a couple of minutes of reflection about the meetings I attended, what I tried to achieve, what was left off the list, what needs to be done today, and so forth and so on. And that's important because if you don't create the space to reflect on how the day's gone, it's just a blur after 24 hours and you can't remember what you did. I mean, how many of you remember what you did on Monday? It's not that easy unless you go back to your diary. That's how busy we've become in our world. So it's important to reflect and it's important to plan. And at your level, as I said before, your time is extremely valuable. And then the other thing that I would suggest you do is there's been a lot written about mindfulness. And, you know, it might sound a little bit hokey, but mindfulness simply means being in the moment. All it means is that if you're in the moment, you're in the moment. You're not thinking about what you're doing next week. You're not thinking about what just happened. You are in the present moment, completely and utterly absorbed in the present moment. So if you start doing some planning, it's a lot easier to become mindful. So I'm very mindful, obviously, in this lunch and learn session I'm running now. I mean, heaven forbid someone could knock on the door. I hope they don't, but if they did, I just have to ignore it because this is what I'm doing. You've signed up to this. I'm completely engaged in this moment. And so it's really important that executives are engaged in the moment, if that makes sense. So there's some very practical things that you can think about in your day-to-day that you need to really start to reposition things. So I really ask you to sort of go away from here and start making some plans to make your days even more efficient. Now, if you, in your position as a senior leader, you can see there are 3 spheres of activity on your screen that are critically important. You get stuff done, that's the doing. You have to orchestrate stuff, that is the facilitation and organisation and coordination. And there's the thinking time. Now, what I suggest is that most executives do too much doing and not enough thinking or orchestrating. Your role is to think. I mean, if you actually think about it, that is your role, to do the thinking. You're the thinker of your section or your department or whatever it is. So the arrows dictate what you should be doing more of. You should be doing more coordination, which is delegation, facilitation, planning and all of that sort of thing. So definitely doing more of that and definitely doing more thinking. And that means definitely doing less doing. So in other words, a lot of that orchestrating could be around delegating to other people. So in actual fact, the team that you lead should be working absolutely flat out. Why? Because you are making sure that you're deferring lots and lots of your work to them. Why? Because you need to create thinking time. You need to be able to do this. I was working with a senior manager in the public sector in Queensland, and this person was actually in charge of 6,000 people. 6,000 people. And you can imagine he was quite busy, very busy, absolutely frantic every day. But there's one thing that he did do, which I was very impressed by. At 10 o'clock every day, his EA would bring him a muffin and a flat white coffee. And at 10 o'clock, he would close his door and he would have his muffin and his flat white coffee. And so, and it wouldn't matter what was happening. Now, obviously, if there were some issues going on in the workplace that he had to attend to, which are emergencies, clearly that would interrupt that. But quite apart from that, it was downtime for him. So what did he do? He would just sit there and go through his diary. He'd review the meetings he's just been in. He would consider some of the meetings he had coming up. he would start thinking about his strategy at some of those meetings and how he would deal with them. So I think if it's good enough for a person who's managing, thousands of people, it's good enough for you and me to be thinking about that as well. So anyway, food for thought and worth thinking about. Now, the other thing I suggest, and some people cringe at this point when I suggest that it's really important to use a journal. I think as senior leaders, one of the best ways to learn and to reflect is to actually have a journal. Now, that journal is something where you can write your thoughts, reflections in, do some planning, all in the one place. No one has to read it. It's not about, handing it out to people. It's just your private thoughts and thinking through things. There's lots of things you can write in a journal, and I'll show you a few things that you can do. Sometimes when I say this to my MBA students at QUT, they go, "Oh no, not this again, journaling, dear diary." It's not about that. It's about you having an opportunity to reflect. And so I strongly recommend, if you haven't used journaling, that you might want to try it. I'd be keen to hear if any of you use journals, actually. I'd be keen to hear what your comments are about that. So if you want to type something in, go for your life. And then what I do, and I do this, and so there's a book that I've got, and then I put at the front of it the date. So when I start it, so it might be today's date, fresh journal, and then a hyphen, and then when the journal is completed, in other words, I've got no more pages to write in, I'll put the end date. Normally I find a journal will last me approximately about 3 months. And then I can store that somewhere, and if there's some phone number or some information that I'd like to get hold of, I can go back and look at it. So I don't have giblets of paper floating around everywhere. All the key notes that I need are in that one particular in that particular journal. So I strongly recommend that you try that. You'd be quite surprised at how effective it is. And it's not wasting time, and it's not doodling, and it's not dear diary, but it is an opportunity to reflect and to think and to plan. And so if you had a very good meeting, you might want to think about, what went well. If there are a few key things that you need to follow up, they can go in your journal. If you want to strategize and plan about a new concept, it goes in the journal. Basically anything can go in the journal. There are no rules around that. Or if you had a meeting with one of your team members, you could make a few notes in your journal and so forth. But the point is, it's one sort of book, if you like, and no one gets hold of that except you, and that you carry that around wherever you go with you. So that's something I strongly recommend that you consider. I find it's very, very powerful. Now, one of the things you might like to consider, and I know you've heard about this, but whether you do it or not is another question, mind mapping is brilliant. Now, the brain doesn't work in a logical dot point numeric way, point 1, point 2, point 3. Our education system works that way, but our brain doesn't work that way. Our brain actually works like you see in front of you. You have a thought bubble, and then from that thought bubble comes a series of subtitles, and you build it up. So when I'm starting a new book, for example, I'm not suggesting you might do this, but it's a concept, it's a project. I'll sit down, I'll put a circle in the middle, I'll put the name of the book or the working title, and I'll start building up some sort of a conceptual map of what the chapters in the book might look like and all the bits and pieces. So if you're starting a new project, or you're entering into some new training, or you're doing something in local government, get your journal out and start conceptualizing it on paper using mind mapping. Mind mapping is very powerful. I don't use mind mapping for everything, by the way, but mind mapping can be very useful for conceptual thinking, because it allows the brain to flow into other concepts and ideas and all that kind of thing. So it's a very, very good technique, and highly underrated, I might say. Everyone knows of it, but very few people use it. So mind mapping is excellent. That would be another thing that you could put into your journal. So there's a whole bunch of things that would be very effective there as well. Now, you should be constantly asking yourself this question. Look, when you've had a good day at work, normally the reason that you've had a good day at work, without getting into detail, is because you've probably done some really important high leverage things. You've really kicked some goals. And the flip side of that is when you've had a bad day at work, you will find that it's probably because you've been interrupted from woe to go and there's been nothing particularly useful that's come out of it. Tony's just mentioning here, thanks Tony, this is very useful. Tony said there's a free software program I use which is called Free Mind. It gives you the layout, you can print them out. So there you go. Thanks, Tony. So Free Mind, I'll actually have a look at that later too. I haven't seen that. So that's the sort of contribution. Excellent. Thanks, Tony. So what I suggest you do is constantly ask yourself this question, and of course you can journal this as well. What will be my legacy? So you're in a position at the moment, and I assume a fairly senior position. What is the one thing that you want to be remembered for when you finish this position and move on to your next position? Now, I know you've got lots of things to do. We all have. But if there was one legacy that you'd like to leave, what would it be? And that's a really important question as a leader. You can't achieve everything. So even at a senior level, you won't get everything done on your list. But if there was one critically important thing that you wanted to achieve in your executive role, what would it be? Write it down. Now, if you're struggling with that, then it is definitely worth considering that question, isn't it? Because we all want to leave a legacy, don't we? And the legacy mightn't be actually accomplishing something in particular. A legacy could well be that you've enacted a certain couple of values that are important. So, for example, a legacy might be growth and development. So you might have a legacy that you want to build your team's capacity up, and you are going to sponsor their growth and development. So that could be a great legacy. So it's important to ask that question. And I think, you really don't get a chance to think about this sort of stuff day to day, do you? So you really need to create that thinking space to be able to ask yourself that question. And I'm hoping you'll come back with a decent answer. Now, we need to talk about when and where you can have your thinking time. You get paid to think, actually, if you really want to know, not sitting around doing nothing, but you do get paid to think. You're in a strategic role. You've got to think about how things roll out, how you plan, how you instigate, how you coordinate, how you strategize, how you develop. These things are the nature and the core of what you do. You can't afford not to have thinking time. And all of us, of course, are pushed from pillar to post when it comes to that. So where can you do that? What sort of ideas? I'd be actually keen to hear what some of you have got. Where do you create your thinking time? People talk about being very accessible. A good thing. I mean, you should be accessible at different times. But what about being inaccessible as well? I mean, is there a time and a place where you need to create that space and time for you to be able to create time to think through? Now, you don't need hours and hours of time to think. You just need 15 minutes here, 10 minutes there, but you need to have that time. You need to be able to create that space, to be able to recalibrate. I mean, one of the great things, isn't it interesting, when we come back from a holiday, all of us are so refreshed and cannot believe how we're feeling. It only takes about 24 hours and we're back into our old ways again. But it's magic, that moment when you come back to work, because you've created a lot of thinking time. Subconsciously, you've thought a lot about things. Things are put in perspective. Now, you can't do that all the time, of course. That's our big picture thinking time. But what we want to do is create buffers and times when we can do that. So you're in that business. All right, so where do you create your thinking time, and what can you do in that thinking time that will help you with that? All right, now I've got a statement here that I hope makes a lot of sense to you. It certainly does to me. I think it's one of the most powerful statements I've heard. I actually don't know who said it. I can't take credit for it, but I've certainly heard it somewhere, and I think it's brilliant. And let me just read it through so that you get the auditory as well. So, you never have enough time to do everything. That's true, isn't it? We don't have enough time to do everything. We've only got 24 hours in a day. I mean, there is only, I mean, you can work longer hours, but you're never going to get everything done anyway. So that's that. First, we've got to be there. We've got to understand that. We've got to accept that you won't get enough time to do everything. So that's the first part of the statement. The second part of the statement is, but you will always have enough time to do the important things. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? In other words, um, the question is, what's important in the work that you do? And I guess by definition, what isn't as important would be the other things. But for you to leave a legacy and for you to make an impact in your position, you have to be able to answer the question, what are the key important things that I'm trying to achieve? Now, I don't mean, I've got a list of 10 things here and I've got 2 I've got to complete. The key question is, what is important for me in this role? Where can I bring the greatest leverage for the least amount of effort? And I can tell you now pretty clearly what it is. Your meetings with the people that you lead, that is your team, okay, the people that report to you, giving them time and perspective and influencing them is critically important, okay? Because obviously, if you can get changes in their behavior and the way they think, it will reverberate throughout your organization. You are leveraging your ability to influence by influencing the people that report to you. So you can't squib on that. And I've often said to people, you really should be having regular catch-ups with each of your team members. And I'm not talking project meetings. I'm talking catch-ups where we can talk about their ideas and some thoughts and strategize and just have a conversation. You might say, well, I don't have time for that. Well, to me, the capacity to change and to organize and to get things done can be increased manyfold by just having regular checkups or check-ins, I should say, with your team members. So give that some thought. But I think it's a great saying. So the first liberating thing is we won't get everything done on our list, right? You just got to accept that. That's just the way it is. It's impossible. Even if we gave you, we could play God and gave you 48 hours a day, would you get everything done? No. Even if we gave you 72 hours a day, would you get everything done? No. It's not going to happen. But you will have enough time in the time you've got to do the important things. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, what are the key drivers for me in the role that I'm at? So that gives you food for thought. Again, journaling can help you with that. Okay? Now, the diagram I've got here is an original. This came from some of my work many years ago now, but it's gone quickly. But at the end of the day, if you look at your day, it's made up of 2 parts. You've got a proactive and a reactive part. So what that means basically is this, that some of your day you can plan and work out what you're going to do. And in fact, at your senior level, most of your day should be proactive. So in other words, you can decide where you are, what you're doing, what you're thinking about, what you're working on. That's proactive. You plan that. But we also know, because we're working with people and organizations, that we're going to have to react to certain things. So you might not know what that'll be on Monday, but there'll be a whole lot of things that'll happen that you aren't anticipating, and you're expected to react to that. Now, you can't just close your door and not react to any of those things. So your day, the circle represents your day, and the line down the middle represents, part of your day is proactive and part of it's reactive. Now, I'm hoping at your level that the proactive part of your day is larger than the reactive part of your day, because at a senior level, that's what it should be. It doesn't mean you're not going to be interrupted, but it does mean that you should be sort of working out how you spend your time at your level, because it's critically important that you do. But nevertheless, irrespective of what the percentages are, whether it's 40, 60 or, 80, 20, whatever it might be, and of course it varies from day to day, doesn't it? But whatever it might be, the point of this exercise is this, that proactive requires a certain type of thinking and skill set, and reactive requires a different type of thinking and skill set. So both of those are different. So let's have a look. So proactive is, of course, where you decide. So you make the decision about what meetings you attend. You make the decision about what activities you work on. You make the decision on what projects that you're going to show some interest in. So that's the you decide proactive side. What all that sums up to be is to be effective. Now, effective means exactly as I've got it there. Am I doing the right thing in the right way at the right time? In other words, am I actually attending to priorities? So obviously that side of your day is all about priorities. It's all about working out what's important and making sure that other things don't get in the way and that you deal with those things that are important, and that's the critical skill set for that. But of course you're going to be interrupted during the day, and you expect to be interrupted, and it's part of the job. So no one's denying that that's not an important part of the job. But essentially, that's a different kind of mindset, isn't it? That's the mindset where others decide. So that's, of course, are the interrupters. They're the people that are going to interrupt you. And so they decide, not you. So people will interrupt you at different points about all sorts of things. So this is about not being effective, but being efficient. And what efficient means is, how can I complete these interruptions effectively, right? So I want to get some results, but to do it in a way that's not going to take up a huge amount of my time. So obviously you want to try and minimize your reactive time as much as you probably can, whilst not compromising on making sure that those interruptions aren't dealt with in the appropriate way. So, for example, someone approaches you about some kind of a crisis. Well, obviously, you need to deal with it, because it could become much worse. So you deal with the crisis, but the point is that you need to deal with the crisis as efficiently as possible, so that the crisis is dealt with efficiently, but it doesn't take up as much time as perhaps it could. Now, some things are unavoidable, of course. But the question you've got to ask yourself then is, how can I reduce the amount of time on this? That's the question. So how can I reduce the amount of time, I suppose, is a supplementary question there, and all the while, how do I make sure that the outcomes are being met, whatever they might be? So you see you've got priorities on the left-hand side and systems on the right-hand side. Now, systems don't mean some bureaucratic thing, but systems could simply mean, when you're on the phone, there's an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So an introduction is just, a little bit of chit chat. The body is the key aspect of the call, and then the conclusion is what course of action or what commitments will be made out of the phone call. So that's a system. So that's what I mean by systems. So you need to have both of those skill sets working for you in order to be efficient and effective, if that makes sense. So any questions, any comments, any observations, type them in and I'll be happy to deal with them. So while you're doing that, I think one of the most powerful, Richard Koch wrote a book called The 80-20 Rule. And of course, he didn't invent the 80-20 rule. That was the Italian economist Pareto. And Pareto I'm sure you've heard this story before, but he basically came up with an idea that the effort that's put into something doesn't necessarily equate with the output. So the idea is that just because you spend 2 hours on something doesn't mean you get 2 hours of benefit. And likewise, you can spend a split second on something and get a major breakthrough. So his argument was that the amount of time you put into something doesn't necessarily equate to the output. And that all sounds very logical, and we'd understand that. But of course, and it plays out in reality, but of course, we've got to actually plan our day around the 20-80 rather than the 80-20. So the idea is, what can you and I do with the least amount of effort that'll give us absolutely maximum output? That's the key question you've got to ask yourself, not, putting all this effort in only giving me a small return. Now, if you don't plan and you don't have thinking time, well, of course, it's not quite so clear and obvious what those things might be. But here's some examples that I might put up for you. I'm sure you've seen or heard of examples like this. So 20% of your effort will give you 80% of your results. If you actually think about it, I mean, it might not be exactly 80-20, but you've got the idea. 20% of the efforts that you put in will give you 80% of your results. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that the flip side's true, that 80% of your effort will only give you 20% of your results. All right, so therefore and as I said, when you've had a bad day at the office, it's highly likely that you've probably been spinning your wheels. In other words, you've probably had an 80-20 day rather than a 20-80 day. In other words, you've put in a lot of effort, but you haven't got much to show for it. 20% of your ratepayers will make 80% of the complaints. I'm sure if you talk to your customer service officers, that would be true. They'd see the same people coming back with different complaints, which basically means that 80% of the ratepayer base make 20% of the complaints. So you've actually, you can apply Pareto's principle pretty much to anything. 20% of your team, this is a bit scary, isn't it? But 20% of your team will do 80% of the work. It's true. If you've got 10 people in your team, 2 of them will do probably 80% of what's required, and the other 8 will do 20% of what's required. Just human nature. 20% of the projects will take up 80% of your time. Not all projects will take up all your time, but a small minority projects will take up the majority of your time. 20% of your work day will give you 80% of your satisfaction. Now, the whole day won't be beer and skittles, but I'll guarantee that a small aspect of it will be. 20% of your clients will yield you 80% of your revenue. Well, if you're in a business, that is. So you've got a situation where if you talk to anyone in business, they'll tell you that the majority of their revenues only comes from a small minority of customers. And obviously what that means is that they've got to look after their interests, those customers, because they don't want them to go to their competitors because they're critically important to their business. So you can apply this in anything. But I think the important thing for you is to think about managing your time and managing your interruptions and distractions around Pareto's principle. Sometimes it's not obvious when you enter into something, of course, that it is going to yield you a result until you're halfway through it, and then it's too late. True enough, but at least when you're planning out your day and you're thinking about how you're going to tackle things, think about it from an 80-20, or more importantly, from a 20-80 perspective. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. And of course, if you need to read more about that, Richard Koch wrote a great book, The 80-20 Rule, and he goes into a huge number of details and some interesting insights into this 80-20 rule, far more than I'm going in today. So that can be very, very effective. Okay, moving right along. Ultimately, what that means, of course, is that if you've got 10 things to do today or Monday or whenever it is that you're going to do them, it's probably likely, if you looked at those 10 things, that 8 of them would only yield you 20% of your productivity, and 2 of them will give you 80% of your productivity. And basically what that means is that writing a to-do list is a waste of time unless you make some very deliberate priorities around what needs to be done first, and to do that on the basis of the 20-80 principle. In other words, which of these 10 things can I do which will give me the greatest leverage in terms of my productivity is the key question. Okay, so just writing a list of things on a piece of paper is a waste of time because you haven't made any priorities. You haven't made any judgments about which of those things will give you the greatest leverage. And probably if you don't put a priority next to them, you'll probably do the easy one first, human nature, which doesn't necessarily mean the easier one is actually going to be the most productive one. So that's why I'm a little skeptical of to-do lists, because a lot of people don't put, the priorities next to them as such. Okay, now Stephen Covey, who is no longer with us, wrote that great book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And on page 174 of that book, he has this matrix, which I think is brilliant. And it really just hits home how critically important it is for us to be absolutely in the zone when it comes to our work. So you'll notice up the top, if you haven't been familiar with this, and even if you have, we'll revisit it, you've got urgency. So local government is a classic. Local government, in most cases, works on an urgency paradigm. In other words, it works on a deadline-driven agenda. But the problem with deadlines, of course, is that not all deadlines are actually important. And then over on the left-hand side, you've got another paradigm or another dimension, which is about important and not important. So quadrant, and you'll see here, you can see here quadrant 1, quadrant 2, 3, and 4. You'll notice that quadrant 1 are things that are important and urgent. Now, obviously, you and I need to spend our time in quadrant 1 first. If something's urgent and it's important, it requires your time. So these would be crises, these would be demands, big picture demands, council directives, deadline-driven projects, and all the rest of it. So I don't think any of us have a problem with quadrant 1. We basically have to deal with quadrant 1. Now, here's where the challenge comes in. If we go, if you look directly down from quadrant 1, you've got things that are urgent and not important. Now, because they're urgent, they're probably in your face. These are things that you kind of have to deal with, but they're not going to give you any benefit whatsoever. So these are things like some mindless emails, these are interruptions, these are phone calls, some phone calls, not all. These are things that are not related to your core job description. Now, the trick for you is not to spend too much time in quadrant 3. In other words, you've got to be there, because if the phone rings, it's a good idea to pick it up. But it doesn't mean you've got to spend half an hour talking to the person at the other end. So the trick is to get out of quadrant 3 as quickly as you can. In other words, remember I talked about being reactive. So quadrant 3 are those things that you have to react to, but a lot of them aren't important. Now, where the magic occurs is in quadrant 2. This is over here. These are things that are important, but not urgent. So these are the things that make the huge difference. And these are the things that we often get left off our list. These are the 20-80 rule concepts. So have a look down the list. Preventative action, coaching and training, planning, organising new opportunities, continuous improvement measures, performance management. Now these things, if you do not deal with them, ultimately will become what? They'll become a quadrant 1 thing. So all of these things over here, if you don't deal with them, will ultimately end up in this box over here. And then you're going to have this incredible amount of work to do and not enough time to do it in. Now, because these things are important and not urgent, it is very easy not to deal with them. You just think, okay, I won't go there. I won't worry about that because it's not urgent. I understand it's important, but because it's not urgent, I won't do it. ultimately what will happen is that it will become important and urgent, those things, right? So the trick for you is to do something or a few things each day that are quadrant 2 activities, particularly if they are based on the 2080 principle. So it's really important to start thinking, well, what are these things? So it could, these check-ins with your team members, they're not urgent. I mean, if you cancelled a check-in with a team member, I'm sure they'd find something else to do, and certainly you would. That's why you've cancelled it. But ultimately, if you don't deal with it sooner or later, you're going to have a very long meeting with them about a whole range of things. If you've got a difficult person that you're dealing with and you don't give them feedback on their performance and you don't work with them, it will ultimately become a serious crisis and performance management issue where all your time, effort, and energy is spent on documenting everything that person's ever done or not done. That'll be a quadrant 1 activity. So you see what I mean, that the quadrant 2 things, so try and be driven by importance and not urgency. That's the bottom line in all this. Of course, you've got to get urgent things done. I'm not suggesting you ignore important and urgent things. Of course, that's where you start off. You migrate down to 3 because obviously you have to go there because these are reactions that you've got to deal with. And then you get that done as quickly as possible, and you then go straight to quadrant 2 and deal with things that are important and not urgent, and try not to be in quadrant 4 because that's just wasted time. That's, people say they're busy and they don't get anything done. So anyway, so that's a good little insight into thinking about being importance driven and not urgent driven. And at your level, your priorities are critically important. So yeah, do a to-do list. I think it's a very good thing to do. But if you do a to-do list, and if you have used one or whatever, please do prioritize those items in terms of A's, B's, and C's, and 1s, 2s, and 3s. And don't do it on the basis of what you enjoy doing. Don't do it on the basis of anything other than asking yourself a very, very important question. What will be the ultimate outcome for dealing with this problem? In other words, if it's a seriously good result, then you need to make it a high priority. Now, that stuff's not easy to do, but I find, that sort of stuff can be done, at home, in front of the news, at telly or something. You can do that on your iPhone. There are a lot of good daily planning apps that you can tap into. If you don't like daily planning, then you can sit down and map it out on your Google or Outlook calendar. All right, so if you're going to do a daily diary, a daily planning, then I suggest you do it every day. I mean, it's not just a couple of days a week when you're under stress. You do it every day, and it becomes habitual. It's something you just do as part of what you do. You feel better when you've done it. And why do you confine it to 10 things? Well, the fact is, if you write everything down on the list, it could go on forever, and then you get demoralized. So the first priority is to cut it down to 10. And let's face it, when you've had a good day, you'll probably knock off 4 of those 10 things. So you're not going to get all 10 done. That's the other side of it. So what are your top 10 priorities tomorrow? And what are they in terms of priorities? And then you just carry over the ones that haven't been done to the next day and so forth. So just pride yourself on getting yourself well organized, I think, is a really important message that I want to get through to you today. Now, what about when people interrupt you? You may have heard of the GROW model, which is a model that was created by John Whitmore, who it's a coaching model. So, when you get some interruption, someone knocks on your door, they want to talk to you about something. Now, what a lot of people do, of course, is they just give them an answer at the door, and all you're doing is training the person to keep coming back to you because They don't have to take any accountability, no responsibility. They just come to you and you give them the answer. It's kind of like it's called, they've got a monkey on their back and they bring you the monkey and they put it on your back and you ultimately end up wearing a monkey because you have decided to answer their question for them. So instead of doing that, try this, and particularly at your level where you've got people who really at the next level down should really be able to think for themselves. So GROW stands for goal, reality, options, and way forward. So somebody comes to your door, your first question to them is, what's the end result you're trying to achieve? The second question is, what are the barriers getting in the way? Third question is, what are the options open to you to resolving this? And the fourth question is, what do you need to do next? Now, you'll find that will reduce a 45-minute conversation down to about 5-10 minutes most. You'll find that person will actually walk away far more motivated and ready to go because they've run an idea past them, and all you've done is ask them a series of questions. So try not to be in the question answering mode. The old adage is, instead of catching the fish for people, teach people how to fish. And you do it by asking questions. Now, the other thing I'd suggest you do, and I know we're getting short of time coming up, so I'll rush through these last couple of points. What are the two values that are really important to you and your team? Non-negotiable. Have you ever thought about that? Have you actually thought about what you expect most of all? What are the professionalism, teamwork, honesty? What are the values? And have you shared that with your team? Have you put those on the table overtly and said, these are two things that I want to see more of in our team? And then look at everything through the prism of those values. So that becomes a really important point. As I said earlier, a lot of managers pride themselves on having an open door policy, but the question really is, have you got an open mind, not an open door? So sure, keep your door open at different times, nice one, close it occasionally, but the point is, if it's open, then you need to be ready for any of the interruptions that come through the door, and that's the reality of it. So guys, that's pretty much it. You're very quiet today. Anyway, no problem. If you've got any questions, I can answer them in the last minute here, but I just wanted to give you some homework to do, as I normally do in the Lunch and Learn. I always do. Look, I've thrown lots of stuff at you today. I don't expect you to put it all into practice. It's too much. What was the one thing that what you found really useful out of today's broadcast, and how could you implement it? How can you create it and do it now? And so again, consider the 20/80 rule. What is something that might be very easy to implement that we talked about today, which will actually have a huge impact? That's the way to look at it, not just whatever. So have a go at that, and that's going to be homework for next time we meet. And then next time we meet, of course, in 2 weeks' time, we'll look at options for organisational structuring. So how you might look at your structures in your organisation, what the pros and cons are. So that's pretty much it from me, guys. No questions by the look of it. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and we will catch up in a fortnight. And have a good go at putting in some thinking time, won't you? Thank you and goodbye.